It started the day I moved in. I didn't think much of it at first. Strange noises, a draft that seemed to come from nowhere, little things that didn't seem out of place in an old apartment building. After all, apartment 5B had been vacant for a while. It wasn't until the third or fourth night that I realized something wasn't right. The first night I lay in bed listening to the creaking floors. I assumed it was just the settling of the old wood, or maybe the pipe shifting as the temperature dropped. I brushed it off as nothing out of the ordinary. But then the noises became more distinct. It wasn't just the creak of floorboards. It was footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing just outside my bedroom door. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind in the dead of night. But that feeling, that unsettling presence lingered. It wasn't just the sounds that unnerved me. It was the feeling that something was watching me, always just out of sight. The next morning, I asked the building super if there had been any issues with the apartment before. He shrugged, dismissing my concerns with a casual wave of his hand. Nah, nothing like that. It's an old building. Things creak, pipes make noise. You'll get used to it. But I didn't get used to it. The noises continued. At night, I could hear the faint sound of whispering, too low to make out the words, but just loud enough to send a chill down my spine. And then the cold started. It wasn't the kind of cold that comes with winter, the kind you can shake off with an extra blanket. It was a bone-deep chill that clung to the air in my apartment, following me from room to room. No matter how high I turned the thermostat, it never seemed to go away. It felt like the cold was coming from the walls themselves. I couldn't take it anymore. I started talking to my neighbors, asking if they'd noticed anything strange about apartment 5B. The most of them gave me the same dismissive answers I'd gotten from the super. It's just an old building, they'd say. But there was one neighbor, an older woman who lived down the hall, who gave me a knowing look when I mentioned the apartment. "You're staying in 5B, she asked, her voice lowering as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. "I wouldn't have moved in there if I were you. There's something wrong with that place. Every tenant who's lived there is left in a hurry. See, this unexplainable in a hurry. And a hairy oricity of creak." Her words stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I had to know more. I started digging, asking around, searching online for any mention of the apartment's history. And that's when I found the stories. Every tenant who had lived in apartment 5B had reported the same experiences. The footsteps, the whispers, the cold that wouldn't go away. And they all left within months. Some abandoning their leases, others simply disappearing without a trace. The more I read, the more the pit in my stomach grew. The final straw came one night when I woke up to the feeling of someone standing at the foot of my bed. I opened my eyes, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a figure, a dark silhouette against the dim light coming through the window. I blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling of dread remained. The next day, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were scratch marks along the walls of the hallway outside my bedroom. Deep, jagged lines that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. I hadn't noticed them when I moved in, but now they were impossible to ignore. I couldn't stay there anymore. I started packing my things, planning to stay with a friend until I could figure out what was happening. But as I packed, I heard it again, that low, insistent whispering. This time it wasn't just coming from the walls. It was inside my head, echoing in my ears no matter how hard I tried to block it out. I left the apartment that night, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me out. I needed answers. I tracked down the last tenant who had lived in 5B, a man named Peter, who had left abruptly a few months before I moved in. He was reluctant to talk at first, but eventually he opened up. "It's not just a haunting," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the apartment itself. There's something in there, something that feeds on the people who live there. It starts small noises, cold spots, but then it escalates. I started seeing things, hearing voices that weren't mine. It wanted me to stay, to become a part of it." His words sent a shiver down my spine. He described everything I'd been experiencing, the footsteps, the whispers, the figure in the dark. "I barely got out," he said. "But I don't think anyone ever really leaves 5B. I returned to the apartment one last time, determined to grab the rest of my belongings and leave for good. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt that the presence, stronger than ever before. Temperature dropped instantly and the air felt thick, oppressive. It was like walking into a freezer. The whispers were louder now, no longer muffled or indistinct. They filled the room, overlapping voices that I couldn't understand. I grabbed what I could and ran, not daring to look back. As I reached the door, I felt a hand brush against my arm, cold, like ice. I slammed the door behind me and fled the building, leaving everything behind. It was alive, feeding off the fear and despair of anyone foolish enough to live there. I never went back. I moved to another city, far from Pepping, far from apartment 5B. But even now, I still have nightmares. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I hear those footsteps again, pacing outside my door. I'm not sure if I'll ever be free of apartment 5B. But one thing is clear: whatever haunts that place, it doesn't just stay behind. It follows you. Quite tight. It all started as a joke, something to pass the time during an unusually slow day at work. My friends and I would often scroll through Google Maps, zooming in on random locations, checking out street views and sharing funny or strange images we found. I'd never considered it to be more than an amusing distraction. That was until I stumbled upon the house. And I remember the first time I saw it, I had randomly zoomed into a small, nondescript neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Typical suburban area filled with rows of modest cookie-cutter homes. But there was one house, one that immediately caught my eye. Unlike the others, it looked neglected, overgrown bushes, windows dark and broken, the front door slightly ajar as if inviting someone to step inside. There was something off about it, something unsettling. But I didn't think much of it at the time. I took a screenshot and sent it to my friends with a simple caption: "Would you dare spend a night here?" We all had a good laugh about it. But that night I couldn't shake the image of the house. It lingered in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite remove. The next day I decided to look it up again, just to see if it was as creepy as I remembered. When I typed in the address again, I felt my stomach drop. The house wasn't the same. The broken windows were gone, replaced by clean, reflective panes. The overgrown yard had been trimmed, the bushes neatly cut. It looked like a completely different house, still old, but now more maintained, almost welcoming. I double-checked the location, certain I hadn't made a mistake. It was the same house, the same address. But how could it have changed so much in less than 24 hours? I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was some kind of glitch, or maybe the house had just been renovated recently. But something in me couldn't leave it alone. I checked the house again the next day. This time it had changed again. Now the windows were boarded up, the front lawn littered with debris. A dilapidated car sat in the driveway, covered in rust and dust, looking as though it hadn't been touched in years. It was impossible. Houses didn't just change like that on Google Maps. But there it was, right in front of me, a house that seemed to morph into something different every time I looked at it. I showed my friends the screenshots, but they dismissed it, saying it was probably just an error with the images or an update on Google's end. I wasn't so sure. I became obsessed. Every day I would check the house, and every day it would look different. Some days it appeared pristine, with fresh paint and neatly trimmed grass. Other days it looked like a crumbling ruin, as if it hadn't been lived in for decades. One night I stayed up late, scrolling through the street view again. I zoomed in on the house, now even more decrepit than before. But as I moved through the map, something caught my eye: a figure standing in the upstairs window. It was faint, barely noticeable, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was standing there, staring out at the street. My heart raced. I clicked through the street view, moving back and forth, trying to get a clearer look. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, an error in the image. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something about that figure felt too real, too deliberate. I needed answers. I searched for information on the house, combing through forums and old property records. What I found only made things worse. The house had a history, a dark one. Years ago, it had been the site of a gruesome murder-suicide. A man had killed his wife and 2 children before taking his own life. The house had remained empty ever since, its reputation keeping potential buyers away. Locals whispered that it was haunted, that strange things happened to those who went near it. The more I read, the more I felt the weight of dread pressing down on me. It wasn't just a house. It was a place where something terrible had happened, and now it was appearing to me, changing, warping through my computer screen. I thought about stopping, about leaving it alone and moving on with my life. But I couldn't. I was too deep, too caught up in the mystery of it all. I had to see it for myself. I had to know if the house was real. I drove to the address on a Sunday morning. The neighborhood looked just as it had on Google Maps, quiet, ordinary. But as soon as I saw the house, my breath caught in my throat. It looked exactly as it had the first time I saw it: broken windows, overgrown yard, the front door slightly ajar. I parked my car and stepped out, my heart pounding in my chest. The house loomed over me, silent and imposing. I stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure if I should go any closer. Then I heard it, a faint creaking sound like someone walking across the floor inside. I moved toward the front door, my feet dragging as if the air itself was holding me back. I peered through the gap in the door, half expecting to see someone standing on the other side. But there was nothing, just darkness. Darkness. You don't know what possessed me to step inside, but I did. The air inside the house was heavy, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The house felt wrong, like it was watching me. Then I saw it. In the corner of the living room, there was a mirror, old, dusty, with a crack running through the glass. I approached it slowly, my reflection distorted by the crack. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. Standing behind me was the figure from the window. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, gasping for breath. I drove away, the house disappearing in the rearview mirror, but the image of that figure burned into my mind. I haven't looked at the house on Google Maps since that day. I can't. I know that if I do, I'll see it again, changing, warping, the figure in the window, watching, waiting for me to come back. But sometimes, late at night, I can't help but wonder what would happen if I did look again. What would the house show me now? Would it be different, or would it be the same? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to find out. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After months of searching, I finally found an apartment I could afford in the city. It was small, but it had charm. Exposed brick, large windows, and a sense of warmth that made it feel like home from the moment I stepped in. I signed the lease without hesitation. From the moment I stepped in, I signed the lease without hesitation. The first few days were perfect. I spent my time unpacking, rearranging furniture, and getting used to my new space. The building was old but well maintained, and the creaks and groans it made at night were easy to ignore, at least at first. It was on my 3rd night there that I noticed it. I was sitting in the living room, trying to decide where to hang some artwork, when my eyes landed on the bookshelf against the far wall. There was something strange about the way it sat, like it wasn't quite flush against the wall. Curious, I got up and ran my fingers along the edges, feeling for any gaps. And that's when I found it. A small, almost imperceptible seam running along the back of the bookshelf. A door hidden behind the shelves. I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed it before. My fingers trembled as I carefully moved the bookshelf aside, revealing an old wooden door, its surface worn and splintered. It looked like it had been sealed shut for years, maybe decades. I should have left it alone. Every part of me was screaming not to open it, but I couldn't resist. There was something about it, something that compelled me to see what was behind that door. So, with a deep breath, I twisted the old brass knob and pulled it open. Behind the door was a narrow, dark passageway, stretching into the distance. The walls were made of crumbling brick, and the air that seeped out was cold, damp, and smelled faintly of mildew. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, and the strangest part was that it didn't make sense. The layout of the building didn't account for a space like this. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. With the beam of light cutting through the darkness, I stepped inside. The passageway was longer than I expected, the floor sloping downward as if it were leading underground. Every step echoed around me, the sound magnified by the tight walls. I should have turned back, but my curiosity had taken over. I had to know where it led. As I walked deeper, I noticed the temperature dropping rapidly. The cold air felt unnatural, biting into my skin, and the light from my phone seemed to struggle against the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the end of the passage, a large, rusted door that looked even older than the one in my apartment. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about that door felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be opened. But, driven by an inexplicable urge, I reached for the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, and I was hit by a wave of cold air so intense it made me shiver. The room beyond was pitch black, but as I stepped inside, I realized I wasn't alone. The first thing I noticed was the smell, rotten, stale, like something had died long ago and had been left to decay. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room, revealing faint outlines of objects scattered across the floor. Old furniture, broken and covered in dust, was strewn about, along with papers, books, and what looked like personal belongings. So it wasn't the room that terrified me. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sense of being watched. I could feel it in my bones, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. It wasn't alone in that room. Something was there with me, lurking just out of sight. I whipped my flashlight around, but there was nothing. My heart raced as the sense of dread grew stronger. The air was thick, heavy with a presence I couldn't see but could feel. And then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound like something moving in the shadows. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. The passage I had come through had vanished, replaced by solid brick. Panic set in as I frantically searched for an exit, but there was nothing. I was trapped. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, the silence pressing in around me. Time seemed to stretch and warp, and the longer I stayed in that room, the more I felt it, the presence, growing closer, watching me, waiting for something. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, but as I focused my light on it, I saw what it really was. A figure hunched over, its limbs twisted and unnatural, like it had been confined in that space for far too long. Its eyes cold, empty, locked onto mine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure took a step toward me, and I finally broke free from my paralysis. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls shifting and warping. In a panic, I turned off the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. And then, everything went silent. I don't know how long I was there, trapped in the darkness, waiting for whatever that thing was to make its move. But nothing happened. Slowly, I began to feel the wall behind me soften, as though the bricks were crumbling away. With a surge of adrenaline, I reached out, pushing against the wall, and it gave way. I tumbled backward, landing hard on the floor of my apartment. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for breath, and looked around. The door was gone. The passage was gone. It was as if it had never existed. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to process what had just happened. The bookshelf was back in its place, the wall behind it solid and unbroken. But I knew what I had seen. That door shouldn't have been there, and whatever was behind it wasn't human. I moved out of the apartment the next day. I didn't tell anyone what had happened who would believe me, but even now, in the dead of night, I can still feel it. The presence, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next curious soul to open that door. I don't know what I unleashed that night, but one thing is certain: some doors are meant to stay closed. If you want to see more horror stories, please like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, thank you, and see you in the next videos.